Hello and welcome to Enchanted Rose Costumes. I'm sure you're familiar with the classic novels such as Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Vanity Fair, or War and Peace. One big thing that all of these have in common is that they're all set in the Regency era. Now, when you think of the Regency, I'm sure there's a specific look that comes to mind. Long white gowns with the high empire waistline and cute little bonnets. And while for the most part that is true, there is a lot more to the Regency that meets the eye. So if you're interested, let's get started. So what is Regency? What we recognize as Regency is in fact part of the late Georgian era. The Regency is in fact a sub-era which actually only lasted 9 years, from 1811 to 1820. It was during this time that King George III was deemed unfit to rule, so his son, the Prince of Wales, ruled in his place as Prince Regent, hence the name of the era. There are several different names for this period depending on your location. Georgian, Regency, Directoire, Empire, Federal, all of these relate to what we know as the Regency era. But for the sake of today's video, just to keep things simple, I am going to refer to it as the Regency. Before the Regency era, the fashionable silhouette was a conical torso with a focus on the hips and rump. The waist wasn't particularly small, but with the padding around the hips and the fuller skirts, it helped create the illusion that it was smaller. The fashions really started to change towards the end of the 18th century. In the 1780s, Marie Antoinette popularized the oh-so-shocking chemise à la reine. While the chemise caused quite a scandal when it was first introduced, as it greatly resembled undergarments, it soon gained popularity and was worn by many ladies. Neoclassical fashions inspired by Grecian dress were slowly becoming more popular as a way to kind of push back against the excessive Rococo fashions. But it was during the French Revolution that the neoclassical styles became extremely popular, as wearing the aristocratic fashions of old France could get you guillotined. So what did these styles look like? Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't all just white frocks with the high waistline and the cute little bonnets. While that style was extremely popular, the Regency period lasted for over 30 years, so the styles changed drastically during that time. So I've broken my research down into 3 different fashion phases. Now, this is not extensively broken down, it can be broken down much more than this, but just for the sake of the length of today's video, because I don't want it to be 20 hours long, I've just kind of kept it in 3 sections where you can see the fashions drastically changing from one to the next. Also, as a side note, this is mostly focused on English fashions, as English fashions were different from France and America. So the first phase runs from 1795 to 1805. So this phase is the most inspired by Grecian styles, but it is still transitioning out of the 18th century, so the styles kind of blended together. Leading up to the new century, these gowns were very reminiscent of the chemise à la reine. The back of the bodice was usually very fitted, but the front closed on drawstrings, creating a nice gathered effect across the bust. Ladies were also filling in the lower necklines of the bodice with a kerchief or fichu, giving the gowns a slightly rounded pigeon bust. During this time, the waistlines of the gowns weren't under the bust quite yet. They were still transitioning out of the lower waist into the higher bust. Between 1795 and 1805, the gowns were also becoming more slim-fitting and in some cases more revealing. There were many satirical prints, comparing the styles of old to the newer fashions coming in. By 1805, the waistline had risen to about the middle of the ribcage, sitting just below the natural bust line. Between 1795 and 1799, there were some ladies who took the new styles of fashion to the extremes, and they were known as the merveilleuses, or marvelous women. They wore the lightest of muslins, gauzes, and linen gowns that were in many cases quite sheer. Now, unfortunately for many of these women, when the colder months moved in, so did sickness. And with the sickness came pneumonia, which in many cases led to their deaths. This then became known as the muslin disease. Now, there were rumors that ladies liked to wet their gowns to further accentuate their figures. I personally haven't found any historical evidence to support those claims, but if you have information on it, please leave it down below. During this time, white was the most fashionable color for these gowns, as it mimicked the statues that inspired the styles. But they were often trimmed with colors along the hemline, worn over top of colorful petticoats, or under colorful short gowns or tunics. Other popular colors during this time were yellows, blues, greens, roses, and light purples. Yellow in particular was a very fashionable color and came in several different shades, such as primrose, janquil, or straw. Now, the basic clothing layers were relatively simple compared to the eras that came before it. So for those of you that are just getting into historical costuming, Regency is a great place to start. The first layer was the chemise, followed by the stockings. The chemise was made out of linen or cotton, and for the most part was cut fairly similar to the shift of the 18th century, but with shorter sleeves. It was knee-length and could have a drawstring in the neckline to help contain the bust. The next layer were the transitional stays. In the 1790s, the stays were fairly similar to their predecessors, but one of the biggest changes was the shape of the bust. Cups and gussets were introduced to the stays to create more separation in the bust compared to the mono shape that was popular before. The breasts at this point were still very much at a natural level with very minimal lift. It was at this point that they started their journey north, and for the next 20 years they would continue on that journey until they could quite literally go no further. Another change was the length of the stays. As the waistline moved up, the stays also became shorter. The next layer was the petticoat. Now, one of the problems that came with the higher waistline was the petticoats actually had nowhere to sit naturally without falling down. To solve this problem, they added straps to the petticoats or bodices to keep them in place. The petticoats were usually made of a cotton or linen or cambric, or even a finely woven flannel for warmth in winter. Next was the dress. Now, the exact look of the dress actually depended on the time of day it was worn, so instead of listing each and every individual one, because that would make this video 10 hours long, I am just going to give a general overview. The day dress bodice was usually gathered in the front and had a round, a V, or a crossover neckline. During the day, the lower necklines tended to be filled with a high-cut tucker or a kerchief or fichu. The sleeves at this time tended to be still longer, either full length or about elbow length. At this point, the skirts are still gathered all around, creating kind of a rounded figure coming from the new waistline. But as time went on, fashion slowly changed and the gathers moved to the back of the gown. During this time, skirts could be either trained or hemmed evenly, just depending on what the activity was. For evening wear, tunics, overdresses, or long trained robes were a popular addition to the wardrobe, and the necklines tended to be much lower compared to day wear. For outdoor garments, ladies had several different choices. They could wear a spencer or a pelisse, or a cloak or a shawl. Moving on to accessories, there was a large array of them that a woman could use to complete her look. From bonnets to caps, to turbans, gloves, coral necklaces were quite popular, fichus, chemisettes, or tuckers, these were all things that were interchangeable between outfits. Ridicules were also starting to become popular. Before, a woman could have carried her things inside her pockets during the 18th century, but now that the new silhouette had come in, and pockets didn't really fit under the new silhouette, so the ridicule became a popular item among ladies so they could continue carrying their things with them. As we're moving further into the 19th century, the empire waistline, of course, is still rising, and the skirts are becoming much drapier with long sweeping trains, bringing around the ever so popular Regency pose, the wedgie. So many wedgies. And by 1805, the Regency silhouette has really come into its own. Now, around this time, women could choose between either wearing the shorter stays or corset, or the new corded corset to help them achieve the Regency silhouette. The corded corsets, with just a few minor changes, would continue in use until about the 1840s. The second phase was from 1806 to 1817. Now, this is the phase that most of us are most familiar with, as it tends to be used in Regency dramas the most. The skirts have become narrower, the busts higher, and the sleeves shorter. In 1806, the English fashion magazine Belle Assemblée published its first edition, reproducing French fashion plates from Le Journal des Dames et de Mode. I think that's how you pronounce it. Please forgive me if I just completely butchered that. Anyways, the magazine tended to be slightly behind current fashions in France by a few months up to several years, and this was partly due to the war with France at the time. Now, the amazing thing about magazines like La Belle or Journal des Dames or even Ackermann's Repository of the Arts is that you can still find these magazines today by looking online, and these make amazing primary resources because not only did these magazines print fashion plates, they also have descriptions of the clothing, and they also published poetry and fiction and nonfiction regarding politics or sciences of the day. So amazing resources. Definitely recommend you check those out if you are looking for primary sources. Now, between 1810 and 1814, the waistline did slightly lower, but then it continued rising with a renewed fervor until about 1816, 1817. It was then that it reached the highest point it could go without moving above the bust, and then started to descend. For the lower portion of the gown, the trains had actually started to disappear in France at the beginning of the century, but in English garments, the trains actually continued on in day wear until about 1809 and full dress until about 1814. Mind you, not all the dresses would have had trains, but they weren't completely discarded like the French fashions. It was during this time that the hem actually began to rise. The skirt was cut with more flare, and the fullness continued moving around to the back of the dress, creating a closer fit over the front and hips of the skirt. The layers of Regency dress were still relatively similar to the first phase. It still began with the chemise, stockings, long or short, corset, and around this time ladies also had the choice of a Regency brassiere. A new addition to the underlayers were the drawers or pantalettes. These came into fashion around 1806, and by 1811, even Princess Charlotte was wearing them, as mentioned in the Mecklenburg journals. Quote, "She was sitting with her legs stretched out after dinner, showing her drawers, which it seems she and most young women now wear." End quote. Before this time, only a woman with looser morals would have ever dared to wear something that resembled breeches, as they were considered a masculine article of clothing. The drawers or pantalettes were usually plain white and not extravagantly trimmed. They were made of two separate legs that were held up by a drawstring around the waist. Now later on, I don't know the exact dates, they were actually visible beneath the Regency outfits, kind of giving a bit of a Bo Peep look, as you can see them peeking out beneath the bottom of the skirt. A funny story, there's actually an account of a young woman who lost one of the legs of her drawers in the street and deemed it too improper to pick it up, so she just left it there. Now, she was rather upset because the lace that adorned the bottom of her drawers had cost her 6 shillings a yard, and she regretted it even more when she spied the mean Mrs. Spring wearing her lace as a tucker the following week. Now, the day dress at this point was still fairly simple. The choice of the neckline was either round, the heart-shaped V, or the square, which had actually come into fashion around 1804. In 1809, the horizontally pleated bodice with a band down the center first started appearing. By 1817, a wide neckline was very common, even in morning dress. In 1806, the skirt was still cut quite close to the body, but by 1809, the hemline had begun to rise a little bit and was cut more into a slight A-line. By 1814, trims had become a lot more elaborate along the hems of the skirt, ranging from a simple ruffle to Van Dyke points, to elaborately embroidered hems or gathered lace and netting and puffed ribbons. By 1816, the skirts were now being supported by a few layers of petticoats that had been stiffened by ruffles or pleats and starch. The hemlines were still rising, and by this point the ankles were visible. The outdoor garments were still fairly similar to the last phase, but the cut of the garments had changed slightly as the gowns underneath them evolved. So moving on to the third phase, this is 1818 to about 1829. During this phase, the waistlines were now falling from the extremely high empire waistline to the natural waistline. The skirts are being cut much wider as the once slim-fitting Regency frock embraces the transition into the wild fashions of the 1830s. Now, morning dress was very prominent in fashion from November 1817 to July of 1820, as 4 prominent members of the royal family had died during this time. First was the beloved Princess Charlotte, who died in November 1817. She was the only daughter of the Prince Regent. Next was Queen Charlotte. She passed the following year, also in November. She was the mother of the Prince Regent. The third death was Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent. He died in January of 1820. He was a brother of the Prince Regent, and he was also the father of the future Queen Victoria. And the last death was King George III, who also died in January of 1820, just a few days after his son. Now, depending on the relationship with the deceased, the length of mourning varied. If it was a spouse, it would be 2 years and a day. For parents, it was 1 year. For siblings, it was 6 months. For brother and sister-in-laws, it was 3 months. For aunts and uncles, it ranged from 2 weeks to 6 months. And for cousins, it was about 2 to 4 weeks. For a widow, the first year and a day would be spent in full mourning. She would have worn all black matte fabric and little to no jewelry. Anything that reflected light would not have been worn at that time. After the full mourning period had passed, she would have transitioned into the half-mourning colors of lilac, lavender, grey, and a combination of black and white, and fabrics that had a slight sheen could once again be worn. After the death of King George III, the Prince Regent actually reduced the mourning period time for those that were outside of the royal family, as the mourning fashions were having a very bad effect on the trade economy. So the layers of dress are still fairly similar to the last two phases. The base layers, of course, are still the chemise, the stockings, the corset, and the petticoat. At this point, more than one petticoat would be worn, and the petticoats were getting fuller to support the new emerging silhouette. By 1820, the bodice had lengthened and the new waistline was sitting once again around the middle of the rib cage. The neckline was creeping slowly to the edge of the shoulders and pushed the sleeves, so it created a more horizontal effect. As the waistline lowered, the skirts continued to get fuller and fuller. The hems were now padded and they were decorated to the nines. As the decade drew to a close, the simplicity of the Regency gown was left behind, making way for the new extravagant fashions of the 1830s. So before I wrap up this video, there's actually one style that I haven't mentioned yet because I wanted to save the best for last. This style lasted from the beginning of the Regency all the way up to 1820, and it only took place in the English courts. Court dress was determined by the reigning monarch or his queen, and when appearing at court, these styles were required. The rules of court directed women to wear skirts with hoops and trains, and to have ostrich feathers adorning their hair. Now, these rules were set in place before King George III took the throne in 1761. So you can probably imagine where I'm going with this. Now, the Regency look was obviously quite different than the style of 1761, but Queen Charlotte was all for tradition, and so she held fast to the traditional court dress, and thus the Regency court dress was born. Just enjoy this. Feast your eyes on this. Now, these dresses were ridiculously expensive, but it was an expense that many highborn families had to pay if they wanted to present their marriageable daughters at court. This style continued at courts until 1820, when King George IV was crowned and he abolished them, bringing an end to this rather amusing style. I hope you've enjoyed today's video on the English ladies' Regency fashion. Again, there is so much information about the Regency that I couldn't include in today's video, so if you want to learn more, definitely check out my links that I've listed below, or do your own research. This video marks the beginning of my foray into the Regency styles, so get ready for more Regency coming your way. Over the last several months, I've had some people messaging me wondering if I was going to be opening up a Patreon account at all. And after giving it some thought, I finally have. I don't want you to feel obligated in any way, shape, or form. I will still be providing content that will be free for everyone to see. If you do want to support me though on Patreon, I will have the link down below. Some of you have actually already noticed that I opened up a Patreon and have already subscribed, so you guys are super amazing. Thank you so much for being a patron. Also, I have opened up a PO box, so if you guys want to send me snail mail, I will leave the address down below and send as much snail mail as you want. Now, if you do want to send items, just let me know in advance because my box is rather small. But yeah, snail mail is amazing and letters are amazing. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's made it this far in the video. You guys are awesome. I know a lot of people kind of stop watching when I start doing the talking bits at the end. So yeah, thank you for watching this far, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Also, to let me know that you watched this far, and to completely confuse people who are watching this and just didn't go this far, let me know what your favorite fruit is down in the comments, because I love completely confusing people. It's fun. Oh, and a pineapple ridicule totally counts. That is everything for today. If you haven't subscribed and you're new to my channel, feel free to click that button. I post a new video about once a month, and that's everything. So thank you, everyone. I will see you next time. Bye! Hello and welcome. Okay, let's just start again. Let's try this again. Regency, Federal. What's that one? What's that one? Directoire, Fire. And by 1795, the emerging Regency silhouette Emergency. Why can't I say emerging? So this period is oh, the Regency wedgie. So attractive. Become a lot more elaborate along the hems of the skirt, ranging from why do I keep saying stiffle ruffles? Of petticoats that had been stifled with ruffles. Okay.